It's a pleasure that you stay here, and we hope to hear your ideas about the non-neutrality of transformative innovation policy and the specific case of Colombia. Thank you for staying here.
Thank you very much, Monica, for these nice words and introduction. Thank you also for inviting me, Cornelius, Tiago, for this opportunity to share current work on the political dimensions of innovation policy and reflecting on some studies, policy studies and policy work in the context of emerging economies in the Global South in general, but particularly in the Colombian context. As I said, this is work in progress together with a group of colleagues from the Universidad External de Colombia and the University of Twente. And so every inputs, insights, comments, feedback, ideas, contributions, etc., reactions would be more than welcome to better improve this process. As Monica says, I come from two main communities of scholarship. One comes from the policy studies scholarship and policy design, analysis and evaluation on the one hand. But on the other hand, I also come from the governance studies on science, technology and innovation. So in this work that I will be discussing today, I am combining these two big fields, but not from only the policy perspective, but also from the political perspective, which combines and gives a better sense of as I would say, a reality as to how innovation policies take place and governance as well. I will start sharing my screen. I chose to use the non-neutrality concept here to highlight the fact that innovation, as every other innovation policy, as every policy has, of course, intentions to and implications from the political perspective. It's not neutral, it's not apolitical. It of course are embedded into contexts and perspectives and interests, and therefore the question is how, to what extent this affect innovation policies, and particularly innovation policies that are meant to be transformative, as the so-called Transformative Innovation Policy, which are aimed mostly to provide conditions for systemic transformations from innovation, from science, technology, and innovation. And I will explain why and how this goes takes place in the context of like countries like Colombia. My main argument here is that innovation policy is a political business. Second, despite highly contested implications, the political dimension of transformative innovation policy is still largely overlooked. Resistance to change, this is the main challenge of this sort of policies, involve four paramount barriers, the ones that we have been able to identify so far in the process of the study, for which there are some political tactics that are necessary for policy survival from the point of view of institutional entrepreneurs, and to what extent institutional entrepreneurs facing this political dimension tend to apply some tactics in order to for the policies to survive in contested and complex environment. And I will use this science, technology, innovation, social appropriation policy in Colombia as an example. So first of all, innovation policy as a political business. This has been a matter of discussion in the policy studies domain, where the question is, what explains better policy making? Is it reason or power? Innovation studies and innovation policy studies tend to see and focus mostly from the wishful thinking that innovation is good regardless of whatsoever implications, but in principle is a good thing, and therefore needs to be a policy object, which is in principle portrayed as apolitical, not necessarily involved into the nastiness of politics, to say in few words. So my question, and what I want to discuss with you, is to in a way question these assumptions of the goodness of innovation on the one hand, which is sometimes taken for granted, but also of innovation policies as a rational policy-making process that follows a linear stages type of dynamics, based mostly on the role of knowledge, of expertise, of technocracy. And I will question this to highlight the fact that it might have some of this as a true condition, but it's not a sufficient condition to better understand the complexity of reality, because its main aim at or it is somewhat related with aspects involving winners but also losers, losers who are sometimes well organized, who oppose change, who react against change, and therefore it becomes a political game. And therefore the innovation policy process is not as much as a linear rational process, but is more a political game. And this can be shown by the contrasting effects of looking at innovation policy on the one hand from the rational linear point of view, where you have these typical 5 stages with agenda setting, policy formulation, decision making, policy implementation, and policy evaluation, with the fact that this policy process is actually not in real life a cycle, as long as it might be subjected to big changes and situations where this rational cycle tend to be broken, which include elections with new parties in power, therefore having different perspectives, wanting to change the whole process, and not in a necessarily linear way. Bureaucracies have also an important role in defining policy, innovation policy processes. The lobby of parties, politicians with their own agendas, with their own interests, individually speaking, and of course interest groups. Critical events also breaks down this rational perspective of policies. The best example we have at hand nowadays is the pandemic, which changes completely the COVID pandemic, changes completely the balance of power, because it highlights the role of new actors who in some contexts were simply ignored. And also not only actors, but also activities, the selection of the problems to be addressed with science and technology, the selection of the science and the technology to be used for solving these problems, and so on and so forth. Business opportunities, and then the limited capacity of analysis also explain the reasons why innovation policy is and cannot be seen as a linear, rational type of process. March and Olsen, long time ago, already proposed this version of the garbage can model of policy making, for whom policy process is more a chaotic process, where problems, solutions, decision makers, and choice opportunities are independent streams, and they do not come together at the same time, where solutions strive for chasing their problems. So it is counterintuitive in the sense that it is not because there is a problem that a solution is found, but it's the other way around. The solution is available now. We need to find a problem for this solution to be applied. So it's a way of explaining how decision and policy making actually take place, where few problems are actually solved, where choices are made for the most part, either before any problem are connected to them, or after the problem have abandoned one choice to associate themselves with another because of convenience conditions. Also, Neil and Toussoun propose and highlight the role of public actors, who elected officials and political parties have also an influence on policy making, because as playing the role of vote seekers or office seekers or policy seekers, depending on the political system itself, and the role given to different actors. If it is a pluralistic system where all the actors seek for equal access, or if we speak about the corporatist system with representational monopoly, or the neo corporatist system with some representation from a different type of stakeholders, where the different actors play their roles in a sort of game or process, anticipating the other counterparts making decisions, and therefore they themselves defining their own decision and steps. So innovation policy in this context is in fact not as independent of interest or of the role of the different actors, and it's the reason why it's not neutral at all. Hill proposes and sees innovation processes and innovation policies and public policies in general to be the object of study from the power perspective. Is not only from the rational or the role of knowledge, but the role of power, where the policy process is a constant interaction between political and administrative decision makers and two potentially antagonistic groups of citizens, the winners and the losers. And the reason is that every policy is taken as a mean to solve a problem. So the selection of the problem to be solved is already a political decision, because that imply winners and losers, and also the solutions or the policies implemented, again, is a political game, because it also implies the selection of winners and losers according to Hill. So the politics and unexpected events make the policy process a non-linear or rational staged path. So this is also from a perspective of Sabatier, who explains the policy process in general, and then I will see how this translates to innovation policy in particular, and then to transformative innovation policy, and then to the context of Colombia. But for Sabatier, who explains the complexity of policy process, explains that a multiplicity of actors, both individual and corporate, each of which have different interests, values, perception, and policy preferences, have an important role to play, with a typical time span of a decade or more to notice impact or change. So learning matters. And where dozens of different programs involving multiple layers of government fight among themselves for attention, for resources, for prestige, making, again, the political game of innovation policy or the general public policy is particularly complex, and where a variety of debates about the policy involved are partly of a higher technical character and held in different fora, also explains this complexity. And the high stakes involved give rise to politics and political behavior in and around the policy process. So this is a way how the policy processes takes place from the political perspective, where there are many types of stakeholders having their own interests, having their own rationales, having the different positions, strong or weak positions, depending on on the policies they propose or oppose in the policy process. So how does this translate, this conceptual view of policy making in general, translate to innovation policy in specific domains? Another way of calling the transformative innovation policy is the Schumpeter's view of innovation, the creative destruction, and therefore the policies aiming to this creative destruction, which is innovation, of course, has very strong and important political dimensions, and the role of politics tend to have a big weight. This caricature shows, for example, this mismatch between the rationals from the scientific perspective on the one hand and the politician's perspective, considering the same phenomena, which is science. In this case, referring to the climate change, the interpretations, the value of information, the use of such information, and so on. Typical STI policy dilemmas involve the balance or the possibility of a balance between at least four main goals. On the one hand, excellent science, or industrial competitiveness, or social well-being and inclusion, or environmental, and even including ethical, legal research and innovation. In the framework of a project that in which I worked as part of the member of a consortium, the UT, we contributed for the design of the governance of responsible research and innovation, for example. We had extended discussions about this, how these dilemmas tend to play in order to better understand the complexity for the design of such as governance framework for responsible research and innovation. Because depending on how you look, the intention and the role of science, technology, innovation, you will tend to focus on the specific aspects, and you will build, or countries build, their whole institutional architecture and policy and rules and the design of tools or policy tools around the priorities that were defined in such context. So that is why it's called dilemmas, because sometimes the selection of specific goals tend to go against the selection of other goals, because resources are limited mostly. We have seen this shifting from time to time over the years, and we can see the four discourses of innovation policy, where it in the 40s and until the 70s were the mission-oriented STI policies, which again are gaining interest nowadays, mostly because of the discourses around grand challenges in Europe, or around responsible research and innovation, or around the problematic of climate change, and now the COVID, of course. But also this discourse moved in the 70s and 90s to more STI for growth, the emphasis on growth, productivity, the creation of wealth, not necessarily the creation of employment, which led to the current situation of high levels of inequality. But then between the 2000s and 2010, the new discourse shifted towards STI for development and freedom to choose, especially in some developing countries. And now is the STI for systemic change, which is the so-called transformative innovation policy, or innovation policies for transitions and for sustainability, etc. The main tenets of innovation policies with transformative potential have to do with some defining features, such as major long-term changes in socio-technical systems. That is why we call systems innovations. The change, including discontinuation in production and consumption structures to prevent threats to society, for addressing grand challenges where the theoretical roots come from the multi-level perspectives, the governance of discontinuation and so on. The role of government in the framework of these sort of policies that are currently explaining most of the literature, but also policy making in around the globe, it's that entrepreneurial governments are focused on specific techno-economic pathways, where adaptive, anticipatory, and reflective governance, along with bottom-up policy mixes, where the policy goals are social inclusion and environmental sustainability in these new frames, as depicted by the TIPSI consortium, for example, where the transformational failures have to do with directionality, demand articulation, policy coordination, and reflexivity. As for the policy principles of the current status of this transformative innovation is directionality, participation and inclusiveness, reflexivity and experimentation, and of course the highlight of the interdisciplinarity. And the preferred policy instruments have to do with socio-technical experimentation, innovation intermediation, transitions management, including discontinuation, and strategic niche management. The question behind this reference to the main tenets of the innovation policies with transformative potential, including the Transformative Innovation Policy discourse, is what is the role of politics behind this, for this to work as an heuristic for understanding innovation policies, process, and impact. In innovation policies, taken from Kuhlman, take place, of course, in some arenas where different types of actors have a role to play, such as companies, industrial associations, but also the research centers, the knowledge producers, the consumers group, the knowledge users, and innovation users, as well as the governmental actors, where these actors tend to be well organized, but they have differing interests, values, and power, compete for impact and resources, sometimes not easily found to have a dominant role, who addresses different type of policies and contests some of them, who search for alignment and policy learning, otherwise can be taken as not relevant, and supported by evaluation processes, etc. Now, how does this discourse and perspective plays in a specific case to show and illustrate the role of politics on transformative innovation policies? We have chosen the case of the STI Social Appropriation Policy in Colombia. This is a policy composed by two main policy tools. And the intention, I will explain a bit more in detail, but the intention is to transform the current situation in some areas in the country, for them to be more inclusive, socially speaking, as well as to be more sustainable vis-a-vis the environment. And for that purpose, they have two programs that focus either on the existing niches of knowledge or on the existing capabilities to solve some of the problems. So the Colombian condition context is a developing country. You can also call it the emerging economy, with some levels of improvement, rapid improvement in adapting technology and developing own technology and innovation. more in some fields than in other, but with some problems coexisting at the same time, such as the issue of poverty, inequality, which remains, which an economy and a society that depends largely on extractive and non-sustainable industries, requiring, therefore, transformative innovation policies for addressing such challenges. It's a country who at the same time is trying to cope with a long tradition of violence, social exclusion, and environmental degradation caused by armed conflict, which is, by the way, another challenge to be addressed worldwide, and which faces weak democratic institutions, high level of corruption, and incipient sense of public good, which characterizes also many developing countries. So the Colombian context is not unique for the Colombian case. It is, you can see examples of these type of problems here and there, and not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. And these contexts are important to better understand the specificity of the complexities of innovation policy from the political perspective as well. If you remember that, according to Hill, this has to be seen also from the winners and losers perspective whenever an innovation policy is tried to be implemented. More on the Colombian context, on the STI system context, the country invests very, very low levels of its GDP on research and innovation and development, as compared to other OECD countries. By the way, Colombia is a member of the OECD, but of course is the poorest in these scales of investment on R&D. Again, has to do with the politics behind the reasons these low numbers of investment, where less than 100 researchers per million inhabitants work in research, whereas the average of the OECD countries is 4,000. But even though it's a poor country, it does have resources for research. It's a matter of the use of these resources because of the low levels of absorptive capacity and the institutional limitations for designing proposals and for spending these resources. But I will come back to that a bit later. And it is, well, you can also frame it as a country with governance crisis in terms of STI policy. In the last 8 years, 9 directors of Colciencias then became the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation. And less than a year of created this ministry, we already have 2 ministers, just showing the context, the political context, by the way. The movement of Mamado Conciencias, which it's a movement of, in English would read as fed up with Conciencias, is composed by researchers, research leaders, journal editors, and so on, who are affected by this uncertainty, this political instability, and so on. And then also the question is always, despite the fact that the Conciencias became a ministry, is still the question whether such ministry, which by the way has been declared as by the Constitutional Court as not legally well supported or grounded, and therefore is somewhere in the limbo, institutionally speaking, the whole ministry. So it's not sure there is such thing as a ministry in the country, or it's still Conciencias, so it's a bit of a mess. But nothing new, actually, unfortunately. Or because depending on who the ministries are, if the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Commerce or etc., it's depending on the individual profile of the minister. You could say it's the ruler of the whole system and the setter of the rules of the games in the whole system and so on. So that's part of the weakness, institutional weakness of the country. And these mining royalties that I mentioned that are in principle available is sometimes detoured because of corruption or the lack of this capacity for formulating proposals and implementing proposals, innovation and research proposals in such a way that can be then traced with impact or good management. So in the specific case of Colombia, it is also important to understand the context of innovation and the role assigned to science, technology, innovation, where it is typically an industrialist, it's based on an industrialist model, despite the fact that it doesn't have a very strong industry, but it still is relied on the perception that STI should be used for growth and productivity, not that much for inclusion. Also an elitist model where resources for STI are only for the best, and the best from the perspective of the scientific demarcation criteria, such as the fact that they publish in journals indexed internationally with high levels of age index and so on, as opposed to more relevant to the needs. Centralized model also focused on Bogota, Medellin, and Cali, despite the fact that this is a country of regions with much more cities with much larger dimensions that in principle have, of course, potential for knowledge production and use and technology development and adaptation. Also called the opportunistic model, where it's typically seen the best solution is to buy from overseas than to develop locally. And also the neoliberal model, where from the policy perspective, by seeing the budget allocated to science technology is seen as the right, based on the perception of the markets as the best resource allocator, and also for solutions of the problem, as opposed to provide the conditions itself. And these main features of the STI policies in Colombia raises the question as to what extent they are seen relevant or even legitimate in the national system of science, technology, innovation, as it is currently shaped. Specific dilemmas, policy dilemmas, again for Colombia, but not necessarily, and you coming from other countries will also identify that these are present in your own countries. I have marked in blue the conservative view. So the dilemmas here is state versus market to promote innovation, or the center or periphery. Here, actually, the center is to be seen, the blue one, not the periphery. At the national level, who does what and when. Innovation system or learning system, international research collaboration, why, with whom, typically north-south or south-south. How to fund science, should it be local budget or in multilateral loans, as has been also the case for a long time, the Inter-American Development Bank being one of the main sources of funding for science, technology, and innovation in Colombia for a long time via their loans. Open access or intellectual property right protection, promote a national or regional system of innovation. The perception as to for investing in STI, should you grow first and then invest, or invest in order to grow? That's also present in the discourse, the policy discourse of the documents, of development documents and of the policies, development policies in the country as well. The criteria for allocating resources, should it be needs-based or capability-based? The decision-making process, should it be bottom-up or top-down, to what extent? The preference for national production of or services, or having these products and services open from and to be brought from the exterior, from foreign countries, and entrepreneurial universities or academic universities. These are the key questions that you see are constantly being raised, for which there are positions. The blue ones typically are the conservative positions, and the others are the more liberal positions. And of course, this leads to the conclusion that everything is political from this perspective. If you look at the fact that there are winners and losers, depending on what answers you give to these questions. So you understand also the implications from the political perspective of the policies themselves. The SAST policy trajectory, the social appropriation of science, technology, innovation, which is the case that we are analyzing. We have seen and identified an evolution of this policy. Remember that the policy's goal is mostly to increase the level of appropriation of science, technology, and innovation by society, by the knowledge users mostly, for them to become then innovators and developers of knowledge and solutions. This policy, the beginning of this policy is around the beginning of the 90s, who, as a result of a mission de Sabios, or a smart mission of how do you call it, Sabios, savant in French, introduces the concept of the social appropriation of science technology, but it took the popularization perspective, which is more a top-down type of perspective, is scientists providing information and knowledge to the rest of the population, and therefore is called the popularization of science. Then in the 2010s, this policy became a national strategy, but focused mostly on the capacity, the absorptive capacity of civil society. In 2012, was then included into the evaluation models in Colombia. By the evaluation models, I mean those models used for assessing research groups that will be ranked and therefore eventually also given additional points when a decision is to be made in terms of allocating resources in competitive frameworks. Then the two programs that I will mention in more detail later, it's Ideas para el Cambio and A Ciencia Cierta, as part of this main policy. I will explain later a bit what it means in real terms. And in 2018, this is the first time where this policy has been framed as transformative innovation policy because of its transformative potential. And it was given in the framework of what is called the Libro Verde, the Green Book of 2030, which was meant to be an innovation policy with the characteristics of transformation in terms of social inclusion and environmental protection. And then the ministry, the new Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation created one of these vice ministry of talent, social appropriation of knowledge, therefore incorporating this discourse into the institutional architecture of the ministry, which gives some sense as to what extent this has grown in the political struggle to become prioritize and also given some resources. Not much, unfortunately, compared to what the other ministry work with in terms of resources, but still an important step. And last year, then there was the new national policy of social appropriation of knowledge, And the two periods with the oval highlighted are the main milestones going from the popularization to local power recognition to system transformation ambitions, mostly. The two programs of this social appropriation of science, technology, and innovation are the so-called Ideas para el Cambio, where the focus is a niche creation, where the scientists lead, and the other program is A Ciencia Cierta, where the main goal is to niche support, so the community lead. So the proposals come and compete for which Ciencias gives some resources depending on whether they come from the scientists or whether they come from community. But the common denominator of these two programs is to fund projects and initiatives that are meant to provide conditions for better inclusion, social inclusion on the one hand, but also in a sustainable, environmentally speaking way. And this plays into different regions of the country. And as you saw in the slides, some slides before, policy-making process is a complex one with a lot of stakeholders with different agendas and so on. This is exactly what happens also at the regional levels, simply multiplied by the number of regions where these mostly royalties resources come from. And therefore, that is also where there is a big room for politics to play a big role. One of the reasons also is that the funds available for funding these projects come from the royalties fund, who for a long time was decided by the governors of the departments where these resources were allocated. And of course, governors coming from every imaginable origin, not necessarily scientific or technical origin, were meant to design the use of these resources. So it made more politicized the whole process and the whole issue of selecting winners and losers. So how this resistance to change have played a role in the case of the STI policy. In the 2010, the first version of the STI policy lacked appropriate political support, small, also framed with small absorptive capacity of the communities and of the scientists themselves, with large regional capability gaps. The second round of the policy, the 2018, the Libro Verde, lacked again political support from other institutions besides Colciencias. Colciencias was the only one advocating for resources, and of course, in the fight for the budget was a minority. The absence of a clear implementation plan and lack of support and enforcement mechanism, and also another politically speaking mistake was that it was launched at the end of a government and near the elections, and the government who took over the office, of course, did not pay attention to this program because it was designed by the previous government, and therefore the sustainability is in question. And in the 2020s, the survival of this, thanks to some institutional entrepreneurs, which I will explain later, still face the fact that lacks a better conceptualization of STI as transformative innovation policy, but the normative character with little insight as to how to achieve its policy goal is another example of the intrinsic problem of the policy itself in a complex context, which simply puts it into a difficult situation. How do we account for the resistance to change in analyzing the role of politics in transformative innovation policy? We depart from the Pearson's, and actually we did a reinterpretation and adaptation of these barriers to better understand how transformative innovation policies, like the one we are studying, faces barriers to change and resistance to change based on four main barriers: the conservative collective action, the power struggle, the dominant policy paradigms, and institutional density. And then to understand how this, despite the barriers to change, this policy continues and it continues to exist with some resources still. So to better understand this process, we have looked at the role of institutional entrepreneurs, the role of transformative imaginaries with the references that are mentioned there. I see Mario Pinzon is here. He is one of the proponents of this perspective of the role of institutional entrepreneur for inclusive innovation, and I highly recommend what he's actually writing on, and he's part of the team as well. Very interesting, because he's doing his PhD exactly on that topic. But also we have seen also Valderrama and Thomas, others on the role of socio-technical resistance, and also the perspective of the niche innovations from the multi-level perspective. And we come up with this table showing how the barriers play a role as such, as barriers, as political resistance to change, and then the tactics used by institutional entrepreneurs to navigate and survive the policy, actually, and make the policy still around and not being completely overthrown. So we have the dominant policy paradigm, such as the orthodoxy of competitiveness and growth as discourse, as I mentioned in previous slide, that overshadows innovation policies for social inclusion and sustainability. So this is a big barrier, and also the political polarization. The tactics used by these institutional entrepreneurs for the policy to survive are also political tactics, where external and international actors and movement have influenced local debates around the role of STI for development, meaning that this discourse in Europe based on the grand challenges and then responsible research and innovation and the sustainable development goals and so on and so forth has played a role internally in supporting the discourse taking place locally. Therefore, providing a an alternative dominant policy paradigm. The second big barrier has to do with the institutional density built around this view of the role of science, technology, innovation in development, where in this case, the system is based on the linear model of innovation, where mode one type of knowledge production, which is based on disciplines and focus on excellence, constitute and create the demarcation criteria to determine what is good or bad, and that therefore plays an important role for the founding of this transformative research and innovation, not only as a means to assess the proposal as to good or bad based on the linear model, mostly scientific, mostly based on excellence and so on, but also the evaluation criteria of performance and the assessment of excellence for the research groups wanting to tackle public money or funding their own initiatives. What the tactics for this is, the narrative associated with the SASTI policy tend to be ambiguous. So the ambiguity of the framing of the policy has given them some room in order for disguise in the programs and use the jargon that everyone understands, based typically on the new public management rationales, in order to coexist and operate, and sometimes even get some budget for operation. Because a radical change in institutional arrangement will jeopardize the implementation of the STI policy in the future. That's one of the ways the institutional entrepreneurs have been able to use the political tactics to survive. So the STI policy entrepreneurs keep a low profile in order not to draw attention from competitors for funding. So if the funding were too big for the program, then probably they will have more fierce rejection and opposition. That's based on the interviews done with some of the managers of these programs, and also of the researchers benefiting from this funding. The third main barrier has to do with the conservative collective action, where conscientious work in relation to this policy is bounded by what is expected from other government agencies, the National Planning Department, the Presidency, the other ministries, and therefore, in order to even use the evaluation criteria, even use the formulation, the project formulation format and logic and rationale based on the new public management perspectives. The tactics vis-a-vis this barrier from the institutional entrepreneurs is that the niche responsible for this policy are able to dialogue with these communities and are member to networks that are parts of this community, which gives some legitimacy at Conciencias, but also at the regional levels, where they are seen as the main actors. And last but not least, the power struggle barrier has to do with the membership to specific communities, which play a role in the policy process, belonging to universities or being related with the gender discourse or the social class or region, as also being parts of the political game, where there are internal disputes among the communities, where you easily see the communicationists. These are words that we made up for better communicating. The idea behind is that within the community of the STI community, there are also sub groups fighting for for resources and prestige and so on. So you see the two bands, the two groups of the communicationists on the one hand and the transformationists on the other hand, in terms of how the STI policy can and should be assessed and taken. The tactics based vis-a-vis this power struggle has to do with that the niche of institutional entrepreneurs have been able to be seen as independent to these, thanks to their more international interaction, giving them some level of stability, but also not only the international interaction, but also its local connections and local interaction, being rooted in the Colombian provinces, which have given them some leverage and influence. So to group and cluster these tactics of institutional entrepreneurs, we found discourse framing as being very relevant and important. The allies finding, but also interaction have had also a very important role. The networking and also the use of some self-reinforcing mechanisms and this is what has given the policy despite the main challenges and reactions to change, because they question the traditional view of innovation for growth and so on. This is what gives them the possibility of continuing and existing, thanks to the role of institutional entrepreneurs. This is very well explained. If you want to get delve into this, I recommend you to read the work of Mario Pinzoni in this respect. As means of conclusion, the current discourse around transformative innovation policy is rather apolitical, therefore naive, and this should be changed. The neutrality of transformative innovation policy should be questioned and should be understood from the context of this complexity that I have mentioned, where ideology and stakeholders' interests matter and matter a lot, where innovation policies with transformative potential to work require a lot of institutional entrepreneurs' work, and where even the systems of innovation, as we pretty much understand with different type of roles, would have to be understood from different perspectives. And also, especially when these perspectives have to do with social inclusion or sustainable development as opposed to technological innovation, and where the goal of innovation practice and policy is social development as opposed to just competitiveness. The only way to for this to be understood and change is minding what I call the middle finger figure in terms of the responses given to why have we not been able to solve most of the country's basic problems. It is not so much in terms of lack of resources or lack of knowledge, it's pretty much lack of political will. If you want to read more about these discussions, we have several articles and books and chapters written on some of these perspectives, which I recommend. These have were released just a week ago. The two books coming out of the Congress that we organized in Bogotá, the Red Gobernanza y Gestión de la Ciencia, la Tecnología y Innovación, where the papers presented in this Congress are now published in these two books, where you can have a look in more detail. Next steps for research, I will leave it for discussion. So this is what I have prepared for triggering the debates that you might have and have your reactions.
Well, our reaction is wow, a lot of so many ideas here. Well, it's open to the question of all the, but as presenter, I have one or two questions, and sure. In the first place, well, one of your slides, you show the long history about policies and political discourses, and talking in 20 and 40 about mission oriented towards ongoing the re-emergence of this political discourse on missions oriented policies. And I was in mind, which is the role of people from these years today, because I think that even in the case of that you expose about Colombia, I think that many people is in not an active role about the dialogue in this with the political power. But the question of the context has changed a lot, because now we have many citizens that are co-innovating the role of user in innovation. And for example, all the movement around free innovation that is presented by or commented, presented, explained by Von Hippel. And all this rhizomatic participation of the people, which is their role? Which is your opinion about the current models of governance, the current possibilities of a good governance, to advance in a good governance, and the role of people in that sense? Because you mentioned some hub in the case of, I read some hub, but for example, in Colombia, have you example of societal experiments at policy labs, something like this? This is one question. The change in the role of people in the appropriation of science, technology, and innovation policies.
Yes, very good question. I do see this growing, definitely. I do see a shift from the usual suspects, being typically the universities and big labs and research groups, towards more community, citizen science type of groups, and exactly that is the goal of these two programs, is to rely on knowledge. That is the reason why the focus from a top-down perspective has shifted to a bottom-up perspective, where communities are not necessarily be seen as the knowledge consumers, but also knowledge producers, and producers in the sense of designing the solutions of their own problems. So I do see this trend taking place generally across the globe, but also in Colombia. And this is exactly what these two programs are meant to do, is in a way giving some power to communities, giving some power to the citizens, where these projects will be implemented, because they are also providers of knowledge, even if it is not conscious seen that way. So I think that is all part. That is the reason also why we see the social appropriation of knowledge as a transformative innovation policy, as one of these transformative innovation policies, because this is a way of actually providing conditions for actual transformation. How big this is, how important this is compared to other perceptions and the traditional top-down view is marginal nowadays still, and for the political reasons that I explained. It's seen, first of all, science and technology is seen not as a priority, but even though when it is seen a priority, is not necessarily seen from the bottom-up perspective, but from the top-down perspective. I don't know if this answers your question.
Okay, the second is linked with theory, because I call my attention that at the basis you talk about innovation systems. That is well, a rise of criticism about this model, especially in the case of developing countries. And why not as innovation ecosystems and their functions, or the triple helix or fourth helix, or other theoretical constructs that maybe can capture the more appropriately the realm of Colombia.
I guess you mean this graph here. Let me see. I will again share my screen. This one.
Yes, because it's typical.
Yeah. I might hear what I say is, of course, innovation has to be from a systemic way. That's for sure. And the question here is, should this system of innovation be understood and read the same way it is currently, if, as opposed to technological innovation, the goal is social inclusion and sustainable development? That's my question. And if the answer to this question is yes, this system should be seen differently because of the different priorities and needs and so on and so forth, therefore the political dimension should be highlighted, because the underlying assumption is that the more the innovation policy is oriented toward inclusion and toward sustainability, the more it touches more interests, more traditional views, more stakeholders, and therefore the political dimension comes to be particularly more important. If we see this system only focused on technological innovation, then the system is a small one. It's a small one, is only based on those who produce this type of technologies and of those who use this type of technologies. But if we amplify and widen the spectrum, then more actors will come into play, still explain this systemic way, of course, but with more variables, more factors, more things taken into consideration, and therefore more political. That's the reason why I am not rejecting the systemic way. I'm contrary, saying, of course, it's a systemic way, but with more actors when it comes to transformative innovation policy, as opposed to innovation for technological reasons or competitiveness.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
I have more questions, but I'm going to write you an email.
All right. Okay. Happy to continue discussing, of course.
Okay.
I see Rick holds hand, raising his hand. Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, very interesting presentation. My question is actually going in the direction of where you see your own role. I think you mentioned TIPSI very shortly. I've seen you and Scott present some work on TIPSI before, which is very much activist. Every now and then I have the feeling that you also, at least, clearly want to give some kind of recommendations also, of course, with your work. But often you seem to want to take distance and just be like the outside observer. But so I was wondering, where you see your own role there, specifically for the Colombian case, but maybe also in general where you see a role for researchers, social scientists like us in this group in these kind of debates in more general sense.
So if I understood your question, you refer to my references to the TIPSI consortium and their roles in the specific case of Colombia, and the fact that I want to take some distance, and then what would be the recommendation?
Yeah, so TIPSI just as the one example, but now in general, I mean, you're making a very clear point that innovation policy, or that innovation as such is political. But you've also shown that the institutions in Colombia are not very stable, not ideal for innovation policy. And so my question is actually also going in the direction of whether you think scientists should get politically active in a way in these kind of debates. Should they get involved? And well, do you get involved also in Colombia with your research?
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the claims, is that transformative innovation policy discourse in Colombia should be involved from the political perspective as well. Not only because my perception of this, as you say, I take distance in order to be critical of this, how things evolve, and to also recommend how things should evolve, in my opinion, is that for the time being, I see all these narratives and discourses being completely detached from politics. And I think that's a mistake. I think it should involve politics in order for this to work and to have impact. Otherwise, it's a rhetoric rhetorical discourse, wishful thinking, inspiration, more than realistic identification of what to do and how to do, when to do, with whom, and so on. This is the reason, my opinion, the reason why in 2018, the Green Book, which was launched very noisy way, very political, as the Transformative Innovation Policy in Colombia, a year later simply disappeared. And it was, of course, frustrating for all of us who thought that this was going to be a change, shifting moment. And the reason was a political reason, is that there was not a strategy for making it robust and durable over time. And my recommendation to the consortium at that time and still today is that, but I think this is moving that direction locally, is that it should be detached to government agencies and should be more rooted into the social organizations like universities or trade unions or corporate associations, etc., who are more permanent, more stable over time, who do not change that much with the change of government. And that's my recommendation, mostly. Does that answer your question? Good. Cornelius.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, I found it very fascinating. And I try to put it all into one sentence and then make it, fit with the topic of governances of innovation. And the two words that I came down to were innovation dissonance. So I thought that, is that a case of where innovation and all its multiple level creates so many dissonances, that it's kind of bound to fail? And I thought that it's, on the one hand, you could say it's a very classic innovation study that you do, like the problems that happen, because innovation studies has dealt with resistance to change for so long. So we would say, okay, that's a classic innovation study because you study the resistance to change. And then I thought, but there's more to it, because you highlight the connection between the innovations and the political, but you always bind it back to the organization. And so I'm wondering, when we look at innovations from a political perspective, and not just as a resistance to change, but to look for the organizational reasons for the resistance to change, then the innovation dissonance becomes, in a way, an organizational matter. And that would mean that if we look at the governances of innovation, we kind of have to, it's a mandatory thing to look at the organizations. Otherwise, we miss out something. So I was wondering if you could again elaborate on the direct connection between the model of the garbage can, and how that then clicks in with creating the dissonances that then, forestall the implementation of the program. So that because some people think about mode 1, others think about mode 2, then people think about top-down models, others think about participatory. So it's a huge dissonance of different innovation theories that come together and that mix with a certain organizational form that then create this mess that we, or especially you, seem to live in. So, and coming back to the organizational question, so how does that actually work on the organizational level that we have and people deal with this dissonance?
Very interesting. I agree. I like it. I would think about it. Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Carolina.
Well, thank you, Professor, for the enlightening conference. I will try to contain myself and ask just a punctual question. The critical aspects of the Colombian STI policy seems to be very similar to other national cases, including that concern with the social appropriation of the STI developments. It made me remember that in Brazil, this discussion was present in the policy agenda during the government of the Workers' Political Party in the beginning of the 20s. Nevertheless, when we analyze the Brazilian experience in detail, one can observe that in the Brazilian case, it was essentially a symbolic policy. So it made me wonder, what's your opinion about the relative importance of the appropriation of the STI development's perspective in the Colombian STI policy?
As a symbolic policy, you mean?
Well, the Brazilian attempt was pretty much symbolic. When we look in the formal documents, in the discourse, they have a lot of importance. But when we look budget, when we look the policy programs, when we look the initiatives, we can see it was pretty much symbolic for 15 years, pretty much. I am not familiar with the Colombian case, so it caught my attention. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I would say it's difficult to say whether it is not symbolic, because there's no way of knowing what needs to be for it not to be symbolic. I mean, how big should it be for it not to be symbolic? I would say it is also symbolic, but with some resources, probably more than in the Brazilian case. And the fact that it has resources doesn't mean that it is not still symbolic. And symbolic from the perspective of looking at the broad, the wider context, looking at the proportion of the budget spent for these programs, so it can be said it is symbolic. But I want to be optimistic, and I want to say it is more than symbolic, in the sense that, for example, as I mentioned, the new ministry has a vice ministry specifically designed for this purpose. So it gives a sense of more than symbolic. It gives a sense. But also a new development currently is that the evaluation system and indicators for assessing research groups last month or 2 months ago gave a big shift towards recognizing this type of activities as excellent and in the direction of granting points for the evaluation. So that it's little by little. Probably that's a good theory, that how symbolic things become materialized over time. And this can be an example of that. I am optimistic, as I said, can be seen symbolic, but it's still some developments are taking place. So hopefully this will not be only symbolic.
That's interesting. In our case, we have a huge interruption of this trajectory when we change government. So
I know.
Maybe you'll have a better luck than us. Thank you.
And hopefully you will go back to previous soon. We all wish so. Tiago, yes.
More questions?
Yes. Thank you, Professor Gonzalo. Very compelling presentation, of complete panorama of institutional policy history, and the national case was very, very similar to others. I agree. You mentioned that you are an optimistic, so I will follow Monica in one of the questions. I find it remarkable those 4 discourses of innovation policy. You put it mission-oriented STI in the beginning. So one of the questions would be what as far as you can understand today, what is the difference between those historical mission-oriented rationales and the most recent, Mazzucato paper? You have the Agenda 2013, the SDGs, and so on. The collaborative approach to policy. This is one of the questions. We can see that it is not entirely new what you are presenting these days, but there is some differences. No, I would like to hear you on this. How so? You mentioned the theoretical roots. I can see that national investment system was spread everywhere in peripheral countries. I was intrigued. What were the other acronyms here you have put it? I was trying to decipher them. If you can mention briefly, just to have an idea of what was those frameworks in Colombia, and two methodological comments or questions for you to give me some light, maybe. Well, the Colombian context is not unique. We can see that peripheral conditioning, the determinants. You mentioned the dependent economy based on raw materials and primary sectors. Well, my question is: have innovation studies neglecting the understanding of the political economy of those regions? You know that Latin America is pretty well known for having stunning scholars, economists in this area. So it's kind of surprising that innovation politicians do not anticipate those kinds of constraints or restrictions in development. So this is for me one interesting, I would say, methodological question, because it's interesting to see how the innovation studies field react to those kinds of neglecting scholarship from the past, for example. Finally, you used a lot. I was quite happy about that, to see the role of discursive analysis for a policy institutional study. You mentioned STI rationales, you mentioned discursive framing, and you mentioned also that neutrality should be questioned. So in terms of methodological approach, I can see you pretty much acknowledge this kind of qualitative methodology. So I would find very much enriching for everyone to debate a bit this kind of approaches. I wouldn't say new approaches, but from the innovation studies mainstream, it is very much, I think, an innovative approach to the field. And thank you very much once again for your effort to put all the big picture here for us, the innovation governance. It was really stunning effort. Many thanks.
Thank you, Tiago. Okay, just to react to some of the aspects you mentioned, the question of as to what extent the mission-oriented STI of the 40s, 50s, 60s is different to today's mission-oriented and the entrepreneurial state and Mazzucato's discourse and so on and so forth. That's a good question. I would say that it is pretty much the same, except for that the context is wider now, I guess. It is not only the mission of entrepreneurial states as put by Mazzucato only. I think it's more societal and community-based, including universities, including research groups, and so on. So it is mission-oriented, but as a societal challenge, and not only as a government challenge. I would say that's the main difference. The second about the systems, the heuristic of systems of innovation. If I understood your question was, what other models can you identify and trace in the Colombian context in addition to the systems of innovation model?
Yeah, the theoretical roots, the frameworks you identified there. It was in a slide after the 4 discourses of innovation policy. You have one field in the table where you mentioned the theoretical roots of the Colombian case, and I understood the national innovation system, of course, is there. It's in Portugal, in Spain, in Brazil, everywhere. But there were several acronyms there, and I didn't get to decipher the meaning. It has MELP, TIP, SNEM, ST, governance of discontinuity, of discontinuation.
Yeah. So the national innovation system is the NIS. multi-level perspective is the HILS, yeah, Transformative Innovation Policy. S&M is sustainability, but I don't remember right now the S. I will think about it. I know ST is Sustainability Transitions Framework. I am thinking of
new models. Is about no business models. Sorry, sustainability new.
I will. It will come back. I don't know now. And the governance of discontinuation. Are you familiar with this governance of discontinuation model?
Not really. No.
Okay. This is proposed at 20, by the way, by Peter Stegmaier and colleagues who worked on an EU project on the governance of discontinuation, meant to better understand innovation policies and systems from withdrawing from one technology to another. And they study, for example, the case of the light bulb, when it was substituted by the not the incandescent light bulb, but the what is it called? Yeah, the one that is nowadays, because of mandatory rules in the Netherlands, for example, you cannot use anymore the incandescent light bulbs, but the other one, I forgot the name. So this means that the whole system of innovation around the ecosystem of innovation around the industry of the incandescent, but this also applies for countries like Colombia, and for other countries that would like to transition from the mining development or the mining dependence for development towards a more clean energy systems. So there is a whole elaboration behind of the governance of discontinuation, what it is, what it implies, who the actors are, what the rationale behind, and so on and so forth. So I recommend, if you are interested in this governance of discontinuation, to read Peter Stegmaier and others, but this is the one I know closer because Cornelius also know his work, and Stefan Kuhlmans and so on at the University of Twente, among others, as I said. I still don't remember right now the S&M.
I think that maybe is sustainable niche management.
Yes,
maybe.
that's
no?
it. That's the one. Yes, that's the one. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Sustainable niche management. Yes. Yeah.
Well, also many thanks for one thing that is very special for me, because I was born in Argentina, you know, and also South American countries for long years have been followers of the others, have been always thinking in the catching up other realities. And for me, it's a pleasure when I read about examples like yours. And for example, the strategic plan of the Buen Vivir, the good life in Ecuador, and all the reinforcement of their the country innovation capabilities, their own capabilities. And all the journeys trying to highlight, to visualize the hidden innovation in South America. And for this thing, many thanks.
I agree. Yeah, definitely. And the methodological questions, yeah, discourse and analysis. Yeah, I agree that.
And the political economy literature seems a bit absent from the innovation studies field.
Yes, exactly. True. Mm-hmm. True.
We are all agreeing in everything.
We are an epistemic community. That's the. conclusion.
We are 7 now. Here.
Very good, very good.
You should found a society.
It's very interesting what you are doing in innovation, inspired by the work of Benoit Godin. I think is the critical view of innovation. That's a very interesting, definitely, and of policy, innovation policy as well.
Count on you, Professor, to help us in the next years. It's no easy task to implant a journal. We
True.
have been lucky. We have a few colleagues are helping a lot. Some of them are here, Cornelius, Rick, Monica, Carolina. But we have many work ahead. Luckily, we are receiving most interesting reactions. We already have 2 issues more to publish in the next weeks. And we are going forward. This is a nice endeavor. It's too many work for so few people, but we are recruiting, actively recruiting young scholars and so on. Monica,
well,
you are
many
contacting
thanks
us.
for your for your kindness and for your brilliant presentation and your ideas and opportunity of this debate. And well, I hope you will be in contact with us.
Of course, I will.
In the future, for future opportunities.
I'm happy to do that, of course.
Okay. And thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Gonzalo.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.